Okay, so I'd like to tell you about iMammalia, which is a way for citizen scientists to record data both for wildlife distribution and wildlife disease surveillance. So what is iMammalia? How do you use it? How do we know the records are valid? How are they checked? And how does it help? So first of all, let's look at how this fits in with the whole suite of MammalNet tools. So as we've heard, Mammal Web on the right is for camera trapping that could be placed anywhere. It might be small projects, it might be in your back garden. Agouti is more semi-professional and professional to calculate densities of animals, and this will also be used later with the data. But if you're simply out and about, bird watching or walking, and you've come across mammals, you can now record them with iMammalia. So it's a smartphone app that travels with you. Now, this was launched about 2.5 years ago, and it can record any mammal anywhere in Europe. It's currently available in 17 languages with an emphasis in the Balkans. So the red countries are where we've launched this with press launch, publicity, social media events and such like. It's also available in the languages in the orange countries, but we haven't had the same kind of launch there, so the number of records has obviously been lower. Nonetheless, we've collected over 16,000 records in 33 European countries of 90 different mammal species. So whilst we need more help with translations in green and grey areas here, we also need more publicity to promote it in those areas. A press launch is quite costly in terms of someone's local time getting it up and on the go and keeping it maintained. So we'd like to persuade people, if they find this useful, just tell their friends and colleagues. So we can see here where the records have been collected over time, so particularly in those red countries where there's been publicity and launches. And you can see the nice collection of data in Poland and the Balkans. Now, we've been getting about 18 records collected every day since this was launched. And you can see the slight reduction during various lockdowns in 2020. But overall, the number of records collected has remained fairly constant throughout this time. Biodiversity data are collected onto a system called GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And you can see at the bottom right here, the last few years' records available on GBIF for all of the mammals. So this includes marine mammals and terrestrial ones. And you can see that the majority of the data are collected in the north and west of Europe, and relatively little on the east and the south. So targeting this towards East European countries has the added benefit that we don't need to add that many records to actually have a significant effect. So if we look at the countries like Croatia, Montenegro, Poland and Serbia, you can see that the proportion of records that iMammalia have collected exceed those currently available on GBIF in the same period. And some countries such as Montenegro, which had a later launch only about a year ago, we've now collected more records per person and more records per square kilometre than any of the others. So a few keen people have done wonders there to collect lots of data. So it doesn't necessarily take a lot of effort to make a difference. Now, the most commonly recorded mammals through iMammalia are the roe deer on the left, followed by the brown hare, the red fox and red squirrel, wild boar, rabbit, red deer, badger, mole and western hedgehog. Now, these are often those which are cited commonly, and we really want to encourage people to report these, even if they see them fairly frequently. because it really does help us understand the distribution and abundance of these animals. But also we can record the less commonly seen ones. So how does this work? Well, when you launch iMammalia, you're first given a choice of which language to go into, and then which country you're in. Now, the country limits the species you see to those commonly seen in that country. If you can't find the species you're looking for, you can always choose elsewhere, where you get the full, complete suite of mammals to choose from. But since this is designed for members of the public who may not be that experienced, choosing the country gives you a much more limited collection of species you're likely to see. When you cite a species, you simply press that plus at the bottom of the screen, and you'll then move to the next screen where you can add the record details. So the location is taken from the GPS of your phone. You can then choose the species, and again you just get the images to look at, so they're really easy and intuitive to use. Ideally, you can add a photo. Now, for many live mammals, you often don't get the opportunity. But the example in the center here, the record is of a dropping. So if it's something like a dropping, scats, prints and trails, adding the photo actually makes a huge difference to understanding the veracity of the record. Some species are particularly hard to tell apart. So the example on the right of a sighting of a stoat, it's really helpful in the comments box to describe the animal you saw. So a stoat can always be told apart from other mustelids because it's small, brown and white, with a black tip to the tail. So adding that information lets the verifier be certain that you know what you've seen. And why is that important? I'll come to in a moment. But if you're not certain what the species is, you can record a generic one. So if you're uncertain of the species of shrew, or you just know it's a small rodent, you can record it like that. If you can add a photograph, a description, and where you know it, the full name, such as birch mouse, these are also very helpful. Once the records are uploaded, you can then explore your own records, and here you can edit them, you can add photos or correct the location, and also see where all the records are collected across Europe by exploring them all. All of these records are verified by experts, and they need either a photograph, or they need to know the experience of the recorder, or they look at the comments. And finally, where they're uncertain, we can email the recorder for more information. But obviously we don't want to pester people too much, so if you can supply photos and comments, that makes things a lot easier. These examples here were all submitted as a weasel on different recording apps. The weasel is the one on the left, and it is extremely small. So even when a photograph is supplied, that doesn't mean the person knows what it is, but it is very helpful because the verifiers can determine what they are. So photos are really helpful. The verifiers can also see how frequently you have correctly identified species, and they get a full list, as you can see on the right, of all the details, including the email address, any comments, the abundance, did you see it live or dead, and such like. Now, the more often people record things and get them verified, the more trustworthy that person becomes to identify the animal, so the easier it is for a verifier to use the tick boxes there to determine which one it is. If it's supplied with a photo, then the verifier can also determine the species, and they get the 2 ticks accepted as correct. The 1 tick is for those where we believe the recorder is perfectly able to record that species, and this is usually accepted for things like foxes because most people can tell what they are. You can also choose in unable to determine the species from the information given. It may be conflicting, or the user may have only submitted 1 or 2 records, or in those cases where we know they're definitely wrong. And those records will not get submitted forwards to GBIF, for example. So how does all this help? Well, the data are used not only to map distributions of species, but the distribution helps predict in areas where there's no records. And that's particularly helpful where we can add data from the other camera trapping approaches, such as the density, and then estimate densities in areas as well. We can predict the risk of disease spread by knowing where the species is, and we can also directly detect disease. So let's look at some of these. Here's an example of the records we've collected of the golden jackal, which has been spreading from southeastern Europe. And although we don't have a vast number of records so far, we have managed to find it in Germany and on the border of France. Now, if we look at the distributions of species, the GBIF data for wild boar that was available when we started this project is on the left. It was very patchy. If we use that data to predict species distribution, we end up with a very patchy distribution as well. Now, the advantage of getting further data from East European countries and some improvements in the mathematical modelling gives the prediction on the right, which is much more believable, and actually ties in very closely with the data collected from hunting records. So we're improving our understanding of the distribution and the relative abundance of these species. And we can start to use this to look at an overlap with, for example, here, wild boar overlapped with domestic pigs in Romania. And we can see here the hotspots where disease transmission might be most likely. And this is a particular concern for African swine fever. Now, if you identify a wild boar record, you're given some additional fields to fill in here, which includes the state of decomposition of a carcass, which could be either fresh, decomposed, or just the bones left. Now, any wild boar carcass cited is then automatically produces an email alert. So that alert goes directly to anybody who registers, such as competent veterinary authorities, who could be investigating cases of African swine fever. So here's the example email. It's unfortunately only available in English, but it gives you the date and a notification that a wild boar carcass has been recorded. And then the user can go into the system and look for its exact geographical location, and if necessary, could send someone out to find that for sampling. So we see here on the right-hand side a wild boar that was recorded in Serbia, and this actually had African swine fever. So this helps with the ability to survey for diseases, and we can also directly detect diseases, as on the left, a few photos here of a fox in northern Poland that clearly has sarcoptic mange. So this shows you the benefits that collecting this data will have, both to understanding our distribution, as well as trying to reduce the effects of diseases across Europe.